Welcome to Talking Economics, a podcast by CERGE-EI, the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute, founded in 1991 in Prague. We invite our faculty, researchers, and alumni from around the world to discuss current economic research and its relevance to the challenges and opportunities in a changing world. I'm your host, Katarína Stehlíková. Thank you for joining us. Why do people discriminate, and what does it cost us? Discrimination is not just a social problem, it is an economic one too. In today's episode, Vojtěch Bartoš, CERGE-EI alumnus and associate professor at the University of Milan, joins us to talk about how economics helps us measure bias, understand where it comes from, and explore fairer solutions. From Kabul to Copenhagen, his research uncovers how poverty, inequality, and institutions shape human behavior and what that means for building societies that are more equitable. Welcome, Vojta.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always so nice being back in Prague.
It's exciting. We are really happy to have you. So, jumping right to the topic, why is discrimination an economic issue in the first place?
Okay, so we always start with definitions, right, in economics. So the definition of discrimination, how I understand it, and how the broad literature understands it, is that keeping everything else constant, there is essentially a difference between two groups solely based on the group attribute, right? So when you think of racial discrimination, there are people who are white, there are people who are black, and keeping everything else the same, education, experience levels, everything, just the mere skin color difference does make a difference in how these people are being treated, right? So thinking of it in terms of economics terms, we're typically thinking of productivity, right? And here, we're essentially losing some efficiency because people who would otherwise be exactly the same are treated differently, or receiving different wages, or being, differently invited for interviews, or being differently hired, etc. So first of all, we're wasting the talent that these people are having. And second of all, we may be also underusing some of the talent, right? So there is also potentially some direct cost to the companies, etc. And this then accumulates at the societal level, and this then creates kind of this cost that discrimination is producing. So this is why I would understand that discrimination actually is costly to the society. There is also some research that has been showing that there are actually some substantial costs.
That's very interesting. If these are, obvious costs of discrimination, why does discrimination then exist in the first place? Because, you see these obvious costs related to this behavior. So why don't they just get rid of it?
Okay. So there are two parts, I would say, to this answer. And the first one takes us all the way back to history. Essentially, in early societies, discrimination could be understood as something like a societal protection. So when you think of small-scale societies, they would be typically trying to distinguish themselves from other societies nearby through some visible signs, right? Think of tattoos, think of piercing and things like that. Think also of skin color, right? For this, you would need to travel longer geographic distances, but essentially you are trying to distinguish your group from a different group. Why would you do that? Because this is a super kind of quick signal that you can quickly check, and it can tell you whether you're in danger or not. Right? So do you see somebody with your traits or with different traits? If it's a person with your traits, you're safe. If it's a person with different traits, it's a potential danger, right? This helps you establish cooperation. This helps you establish trust, etc. So these would be the advantages, especially at these early stages of humankind, where essentially discrimination could save your life, and this is in the most extreme cases. In the less extreme cases, it saves you the hassle of having to figure out whether you can trust that person, whether you can cooperate with that person, whether you can trade with that person, right? But kind of fast forward to current day economics, with all the international trade, with all the globalization, internalization, so it seems that we're just carrying this evolutionary burden with us to the modern society, and so far we have not necessarily overcome all of it. And then this brings me to the second potential part of the answer, that is information-based, okay? So when I told you at the beginning, when we were talking about this definition, right, we were saying that everything else is the same, the only thing that differs is the group attribute. But now, we potentially as researchers may assume that people believe that this is the case, but they might not necessarily do so, right? You may have your own beliefs about what a typical person from that other group looks like, And then comes the question of whether your beliefs are correct or not, and whether the way how you build your beliefs in the first place, whether this is already affected by your bias. So how are you processing this information, what type of information you're even reading, etc. Okay, so then it might actually be very rational for you in a sense of, given the beliefs that you have about an average person from that group, it might be that the rational thing for you is to actually distinguish between people from different groups. This would be oftentimes this would be a rational explanation for discrimination. We call this statistical discrimination, right?
Okay, so we have the statistical discrimination, that it's actually saving you some time to process information and energy, which is costly. And then the other one is the taste-based discrimination.
I think this would be really the one that is more linked to our kind of evolutionary past, which is the pure hatred of other groups, right? So imagine that I really told you, and I was convincing in telling you that these two people who you are seeing, one black, one white, that they are of exactly the same qualities, they are, they have the same personalities and everything else is the same. The only thing that differs is their skin color, and you would still prefer, let's say, the white over the black or vice versa, right? So then this would be the pure expression of the taste, and this would be really the pure animus-driven type of discrimination.
The evolution, which was showing us that these different people are dangerous or different. Where does behavioral economics come into picture? What is what are the benefits that it's bringing to the studies of discrimination?
Okay, so with behavioral economics is very broad, right? Sometimes people would say that essentially all economics is behavioral because we're just dealing with human behavior. But how we understand it is that we go kind of beyond the standard kind of cost-benefit analysis, beyond the standard kind of selfish behavior. So what it brings to me, so we are bringing kind of social preferences into the picture.
Are there any particular measures that are specific to the behavioral economics field or specialization? Is there, are the tools particularly helpful to shed light on discrimination?
Okay, I think so. So what we started doing was that we started these so-called correspondence studies. And in correspondence studies, what you're doing is, let's say you're applying for a job, you send your CV as the first step. And what we can do is to simply manipulate some group attributes. What is it? Typically a name, right? So this is what many studies have been doing. The kind of pioneering study of Bertrand Mullay-Nathan in 2004, published in the AER, showing essentially that blacks are discriminated in the US labor market, right? And tons of studies after that, including some of ours. Now, what is problematic about these correspondence studies is that they do not necessarily allow you to get at, or at least in their basic form, to get at the mechanisms that you would be interested in, right? And understanding these mechanisms is super important later on also for our understanding of how we can reduce discrimination, right? Which is kind of the ultimate goal, right? If we want to restore
avoid the costs that we were talking about.
Yeah. So for this, for example, we started employing these tools from behavioral economics, let's say some of these allocation tasks. Some of the listeners may be familiar with dictator games, where you are allocating money to strangers, right? And essentially just finding differences in these allocations would be indicative of these taste-based differences, right? There is like no reciprocity, there is like, no strategic reasons for giving differently to these people, other than if you like one of the groups better than the other.
So it's helping us to understand what is behind the biases. Can you tell us more about what are the standard reasons behind the biases, or what are these outcomes that you are seeing? Speak specifically about your studies.
Well, okay. So I would start, let's say, from this very early work of mine and of my co-authors, and this is the work on attention discrimination. So this is a work joined with Michal Bauer and Yulia Chytilova and Filip Matejka, who are also in this building. And essentially, where this project started was that we wanted to understand information processing. When you think of these situations that I was talking about, when you think of the correspondence studies, right? There must be somebody at the receiving end of the CVs, right? So these would be the HR managers, let's say. And now the question is, do they actually process all the information that the CV contains, right? They have limited time, so they have to be somehow strategic about that, about the allocation of their attention. Here comes the term attention discrimination, right? And essentially what we are showing is that, in a nutshell, if ex ante you expect that the information is going to be useful for you in order to reach either a positive or a negative decision, you will be more likely to pay attention to that particular information, right? And so this is what we are showing in two different types of markets, where one of the markets that we were focusing on was the labor market, where it was pretty difficult to reach all the way to the interview stage. So only about 10% of our applicants were invited for an interview, as opposed to a housing market. So we were applying for flats for rental. And there, our majority candidates in particular were pretty successful. So it was about 90% rather who got the invitation for a flat showing, right? It's not necessarily that they would take the apartment, but if you showed interest, you would get it. Back in the good old days. Yes. Not anymore in Prague, I would guess. So now we have two different predictions for these two different markets, right? So in the labor market, almost nobody gets in. So in order to cross the bar of being invited for the interview, you had to be pretty good, and people had to believe that you would be pretty good. So if you believe that an average candidate from a minority group has very low chances of passing the bar, you just screen them out without even having a look at them, right? Vice versa, in the rental housing market, extra information about the majority candidate does not help you much, right? Because you are inviting them anyway. So who you are trying to look at and to screen properly is essentially this guy from the minority group, where you're trying to screen out, we call them lemons, right? So those kind of bad apples, you can say. And this is what we actually find in the data, right? In line with the predictions of the model that we have.
So the attention discrimination is one aspect which might be behind many, underlying behind many types of discrimination. But the standard one in the US, but increasingly also with migration in our countries, is racial and ethnic biases. Is behavioral economics bringing some special insights into this area?
When you think of the definition of discrimination more broadly, it could be applied to many different groups as long as the group attribute is not something that you are choosing yourself, right? You do not choose your gender. You do not choose your sexual orientation. You do not choose your age, so there could be also discrimination based on age, depending on whether you are older or younger, right? And typically this discrimination definition is also extended to, say, religion. So I think it's rather the target of discrimination, but then kind of the underlying mechanisms that may be driving discrimination could be similar, right? It's just rather the kind of different weights that you would put to the different channels that are driving discrimination against particular groups.
Mm-hmm. So really the attention discrimination is going across all these, because you're paying different attention to all these aspects the way you were describing in your study. What about the differences across different contexts, right? Your experiments, you did experiments in all sorts of countries. So are there differences in developed and developing economies? Do we discriminate in a different way?
Okay. We kind of do. I think there is a little bit of a kind of time difference. So let me start. I was giving some lecture here on discrimination a few years ago, and I remember one of these opening slides where I had some job ads from the New York Times from the 60s, I think, right? And what this jobs ad said was, okay, we're looking for somebody who is white to fill this position. We're looking for a male. We're looking for and now quote unquote Negro for this particular position, right? And if you could imagine kind of what types of positions these were. So now fast forward to nowadays, and when we look at some studies from China, they are exactly as explicit about, gender norms or gender stereotypes related to certain positions. So also on some job boards nowadays in China, you would find positions that are specifically tailored for men and some that are specifically tailored for women. And when you look at, ethnic-based violence, it is much more prevalent in some of the developing countries where conflict is also more prevalent, right? So it seems that there are kind of more opportunities for discrimination. And also, it's not so long ago when we were also very explicit about discrimination. It's not to say that nowadays if we do not see any of these differences in news ads in, say, the New York Times, that there would be no racial, gender, sexual orientation-based discrimination in our
Just
settings
needs to be more
as
subtle,
well.
right?
It is more subtle, exactly.
Could there be, what are the causes for these differences? Because we started the discussion by saying, there are the costs of discrimination, right? Like they're imposing costs, but also to some extent they are, saving you time to analyze situations. So the statistical information about groups is bringing you something. So are the costs and benefits different in these different contexts?
So that's a great question. I don't think we have a good answer to that yet. So this should be something where we always, like at the end of our papers, we say this would be a good idea for future research. So let's think about that. Why we do see less discrimination nowadays in the US than in China, let's say. So much of it will probably have to do with things like social norms and also kind of how norms are being enforced, right? On this, I think there is very nice research that is showing the differences between what people think and what people kind of are willing to publicly say, right? So there is this paper from the US by Leonardo Burst and co-authors, and they're looking at the event of the first Trump elections. They've run 2 studies, one before the election and one after the election, right? And what they are showing is that if you let people decide anonymously about donations to an NGO that is supporting some really racist positions, then you see that there is no change in these underlying preferences. On the other hand, when you tell people, hey, there might be somebody checking on your answers, okay? There's a huge difference. Before the election, very few people were willing to openly support this type of an NGO, whereas after the election, which was, you can understand it as kind of an information shock. So, okay, I'm not alone in my position. There is more people who are, expressing these racist positions. Then I'm even okay expressing this publicly, right? So this would be kind of the social norm story.
What are the potential solutions, right? There are costs associated with discrimination.
Okay, so I'll do a little promo. I just finished writing this book chapter that will be forthcoming, and this is precisely the topic that I'm dealing with there. The chapter is called Breaking Bias, and we're trying to think of how to reduce discrimination essentially and where the evidence stands. I'm borrowing both from economics and from psychology, and there seem to be actually some possibilities. Now, thinking of standard economic theories, thinking, for example, of statistical discrimination. For statistical discrimination, what you need to do is essentially to provide more information. So with current, information technologies, you can essentially provide more information about your particular person nowadays, which should reduce statistical discrimination, right? Again, with technology, thinking of attention discrimination, for example. So attention discrimination acts on learning about your group attribute, right? So if I see your CV and I see your name on it, then I already make a decision whether to kind of press on your CV or kind of throw it into the no pile, right? And now what I can do is to potentially temporarily remove the signal, right? Then I'm making all or both the CVs from the majority and minority applicants kind of equivalent in terms of attention that the HR person is exhibiting there, right? This would be one. So this is more on the side of information processing. There is much more that I'm also discussing in the chapter. Thinking about the distaste parameter, we also have some tools of dealing with that. For that, this is rather the behavioral part, or where we borrow from psychology, where we can think of, there is the theory of social distance, actually, that comes from psychology, right? We are thinking of our immediate family in a different way than we are from, a foreign person, right? But these perceptions of social distance are somehow malleable, right? We can change them. So we can, for example, try to somehow include a person from a minority group into our majority group by thinking of them in terms of different types of identity that they may have, right? Because our identities are essentially multifaceted. So I may no longer think about that person as about a Black person, but I'm thinking of that person as a fellow student, since we are classmates at the same university, or as a colleague, etc. Right?
Someone really, I met at a work camp, right?
Exactly. Right? So this is something that may be working as well. There is this long-lasting theory going all the way back to Gordon Allport, again heavily studied in social psychology, and now there is more interest into this into studying the theory also in economics. Where essentially through extended contact with a person from a different group, you may somehow start working together. There are certain conditions under which this contact should happen, and there are no studies that are trying to test these respective conditions, right? That it has to be, a cooperative rather than a conflict type of a contact, that it should be somehow at equal level, so not a boss and a subordinate, but rather like two employees at the same level, and something like that. And it seems to be showing some promising results. So now the question will be how to bring this at scale, because these interventions are oftentimes costly.
And also, they I think are relevant here for some types of discrimination more than others. For example, does this work for the age-based discrimination? Or what would be the solution for this particular one?
Okay, so age-based. So you're now kind of hinting at another paper of ours that we are writing together, again, with Michalova, Julia Chytilova, and Jana Carlíková, who is now in Rotterdam, but also an alumnus of CERGE-EI. And we call this paper Youngism, okay? So what is peculiar about age-based discrimination is that when you think of ethnic discrimination, you're either born white or Black, right? With age, you're at some point young, and at another point you
too old.
become old, right? So essentially what we're showing in our paper, again, using these allocation tasks, is that looking at representative samples of populations of the Czech Republic and of the US, we show that relatively older and oldest people, or seniors in particular, are behaving very negatively against people who are younger or young adults themselves. And this is asymmetric. So we do not see a similar response from the young towards the seniors. And the interesting thing, so when we start to dig deeper into the mechanisms, we're trying to understand how do people view people from different generations, right? Or sorry, rather different age groups. And it seems that all the stereotypes that you can think of are very negative about the very young generation. So we have a bunch of survey measures of stereotypes, and really across the board, those measures that would be also associated with lower transfers in these allocation games are the ones that are attributed to the young, right? Now, what is interesting about the old, or about the seniors, is that there is some literature that is showing this oldism, right? So discrimination against the old. So in the labor market, it's typically very difficult for seniors or for elderly adults to find jobs. And we seem to find something that is in line with that, namely the stereotypes that are related to productivity. They are also negative for seniors, but they are actually more negative for the young generation itself. There is actually one paper by Farber and others that is showing precisely that in type of a correspondence study. So they have like a middle-aged category person and, young adult and a senior, and they are showing this kind of inverse U-shaped pattern where actually the young and the old relatively to the middle age are actually punished at the labor market. And we believe that part of that is this kind of stereotype, which is more in line with the statistical motives, right? Is driving the discrimination against the seniors, whereas the discrimination against the young is rather driven both by the stereotypes, but also by this distaste, right? So it's kind of a double whammy for the young ones.
What can be done about this?
Okay, so what we do in that paper, and we're only showing a very first step in which we are trying to go in this direction of breaking bias. We run an experiment within our experiment. And this experiment, we are relying on some data that we have collected before on the same sample of Czechs. So we've been tracking essentially mental health and mental health issues prevalence of the Czech population. And when you look at the mental health issue prevalence across age groups, there is a clear gradient where you see that the most affected part of the population is the young adults. Seniors are the least affected. Now, when you ask the population about the beliefs about prevalence of these issues, it's completely flipped. So people would think that it's rather the seniors who are most affected by mental health issues, okay? And the least affected are the young because they're having like these easy lives, and it's all the party, best time of their lives, right? So now what we do is that we just randomly expose half of the sample to the information about these statistics separately from, the main experiment. And what we show then is that those people who have received the information, so to whom we have corrected their beliefs about the prevalence of, perhaps the lives of the young are not as easygoing as I would have thought, then it reduces the bias somewhat. It does not close the gap. So by no means this is the only motive, and this is also nicely seen in the range of the stereotypes that are being held against the young. Then this could be one way of actually reducing this bias. So it seems that there is some mismatch in the beliefs, and simply by correcting this, which is a very low-cost intervention, right? You literally just provide information, you can actually reduce the gap to some extent. So these would be kind of these low-hanging fruits, but potentially that are ripe for picking.
Vojta, this has been amazing. We could talk for much longer, but we're really running out of time. So I would end with this positive note that we see the light at the end of the tunnel. There are solutions, and also there is more research to be done about what solutions are there. So thank you very much for being with us and sharing your insights.
There's also still a gap to be closed, but we may be getting there. So thanks so much for the invite. It was great chatting with you.